Good morning, Room 219. Miss Sosa here. So we're going to go ahead and do our social studies lesson today. We're not going to do a newspaper like I had originally hoped. What we're going to do today is just do a really long read aloud. We're going to read 4 chapters of our book, Guns for General Washington. So that way, the only thing I'm going to ask you to do today for social studies is answer 1 question per chapter. So in total, 4 questions for today. And that's it. Easy peasy, right? So go ahead and grab your book. Pause the video if you need to get it. But we're going to go ahead and get started with Chapter 9, News and Rumors. Okay? Let's begin. Somewhere across town, church bells began to ring. Finishing his breakfast of biscuits and cheese, Paul listened. So we're back to Paul Revere Jr. That would be King's Chapel, he decided, over on Tremont Street. Probably a funeral for another smallpox victim. These days, the bells tolled often for the dead. The pox was everywhere, striking people without regard for their politics or for history. Tory and Whig, Royalist and neutral, everyone was fair game for the deadly sickness. You know what I'm thinking. I wonder if you are too. Gone away, moaned the church bells. Gone away, gone away, gone away. Paul gathered the leftovers of his breakfast and put them in a tin box. Nobody in Boston wasted a single bit of food, no matter how small it might be. Farewell, cried the bells. Farewell, farewell. In the old days, Paul thought church bells had sounded different. He had loved to hear them calling out across the rooftops. Even on sad occasions, they rang out strongly, serenely, full of life and hope. Now it seemed that they were always dull and gloomy, as if mourning for a dying city. Paul pulled on a jacket and grabbed his cap and slipped out of the house. Locking the door behind him, crossing Fish Street, he passed a company of redcoats standing at rest. And who were the redcoats again? That's right, it was the British. Well, the soldiers, anyway. They were all British. Their muskets slanted carelessly every which way. Sullen and bored, they glared at Paul with cold eyes. The boy looked the other way and tried to appear small and unimportant. He hated the British for making him feel weak and fearful, and despised himself for giving in to those feelings. Take care, warned the bells. Take care, take care. I think that's interesting that the author is giving words to the bells ringing. Do you remember what type of figurative language that is? If you said personification, you did a really good job. If you forgot what personification is, it's when we take something that isn't human and give it human qualities. And what are the bells doing? They're speaking. Right. He walked quickly past Fawnal Hall, once the main public market, and now a barracks for house Marines. Barracks. Do you know what a barrack is? If you don't, a barrack is a place for soldiers to sleep. Sort of like a bunkhouse, but much bigger, and it's for them to sleep, to eat. It's camp, if you will. Partway down the Merchant's Row, he turned and walked out on Long Wharf. This great pier stretched 2,000 feet into the Boston Harbor. So, if you're trying to understand what that means, here's the land. Here's the pier. The piers, they go out into the water so people can walk out. And this is water. The Long Wharf, is 2,000 feet into the water. I don't care what you say. I think that's an impressive feat, even for that time, that day and age. So he's going out onto the water, in a way. 2,000 feet, was a wonder of engineering, admired by all over the colonies. Once it had been a busy meeting place, a center of Boston's shipping trade. Here in earlier days, contracts were signed and precious cargoes bought and sold. Do you know what a cargo is? Cargo, if you don't know what it means, is things that are shipped overseas to be bought and sold to market. So that's all a cargo is all the materials that a ship is carrying to take to market. Along the north side of the wharf were warehouses, shops, and business offices. The south side of the pier had been left free for docking of sailing ships. Even at low tide, the wharf could handle the biggest schooners on the Atlantic Ocean. So what's a schooner if it's on the Atlantic Ocean? Yes, it's a type of boat. I recommend you look it up. It's actually a pretty boat. Today, as usual, the berths were unused, except for a small cutter flying a British flag. So what do you think a cutter is? If you said boat, yeah, because we're on the water. Makes sense. Context clues, kids. The shops and offices were dark and empty. Some of them had been boarded up for safety, but the planks had been torn off long ago and used for fuel. Fuel for what? That's right, they're looking for wood for firewood. And so had the furniture inside. Here and there on the pier, Paul saw small groups of people, their faces worn and their clothes shabby. With Boston trapped in Howe's blockade, citizens often gathered on the wharf to hear the latest news and rumors. Paul moved among the different groups, searching for a face. His eyes brightened. Near the south end of the pier, he spotted old Toby sitting against the wooden piling, holding a fishing pole. When Toby showed up on a long wharf, it usually meant interesting gossip. Gossip means, rumors. Paul strolled over and sat next to the boatman, his long legs hanging over the platform. Without turning his head, Toby touched his battered, shapeless hat. The hat had once belonged to a ship's captain, and since Toby was a man of the sea, he felt entitled to wear it. "Morning to you, Master Paul." So they're sitting out here at the end of the pier. Where was I? "Morning to you, Master Paul." There you are. Paul nodded. "Morning to you, Toby. How are you faring?" What do you think faring means? It means how you're doing. That's just how they used to speak back then. Paul nodded. Toby made a face. "Well enough, thank ye, except for an empty belly." "You might have some luck with your fishing," Paul said. The boatman shrugged. "I've got a powerful fat worm on my hook. Mayhap I catch a bite if the redcoats haven't fished the harbor clean." They sat for a while side by side, and Paul waited patiently. When Toby had news, he would share it on his own, in his own good time. He moved his pole about in the water, then cleared his throat. "Did you hear tell of Captain John Manley?" Paul nodded. "Curious. A privateer, isn't he? Licensed by the council to go after British vessels? So what are the privateers doing?" I know that sentence was a little befuddling. Right. Okay, so a privateer were ships or captains that attacked British ships, sort of like pirates for hire, and they only targeted one specific ship, and that would be the British ships. Okay, Toby grunted. "Aye, that be he." No wonder he sounds like a pirate. "Commands an armed brig called the Lee. Words come that he captured a British supply ship, the Nancy, out on Boston Bay. Took the ship, put a prize crew aboard, and sailed her to Cape Ann. Washington sending 4 companies to get cargo to carry it down to Cambridge." So the privateer / what you would consider a pirate for hire, he captured a British ship full of supplies. And now he's helping the boat is going to be used to help the Americans' cause. Okay. Where was I? Oh, there we go. The best lad, the Nancy was carrying munitions. 2,000 muskets, plenty of round shots, flints, musket balls, even a grand 13-inch brass mortar. When they pulled the monster ashore, old General Putnam christened it with a flagon of rum. So, what did the ship have that the colonists were in dire need in this war? Weapons, right. So they just captured, thanks to the privateer, they captured a ton of weapons, or supplies for weapons, from the British. Paul smiled. A 13-inch mortar. Lord, wait till the British get a taste of that. We'll have a long wait, Toby grumbled. There's nary enough powder to fire it. So they got all the equipment, but no powder. So you can't do anything without the powder. The boy frowned. For weeks now he heard rumors that the army had been short on gunpowder. One more battle and the supply would be gone. It was worrisome, if the rumors were true. Words come, Toby added, that powder is on the way from France and Spain, and a new powder mill's being built here in Canton. Your pa's been put in charge. He's got old Jim Otis, the powder master, to help him. But it will be months before they're turning off enough powder, enough to supply everyone. So they don't even have enough powder. So they're getting it from their new allies. Remember, Benjamin Franklin got France to join with the Americans, and then France in turn got Spain to join the the colonists. They're not Americans yet. Silently, they watched the British patrol frigate as it beat its slow way across the harbor. Then Paul asked, "Any news of my friend Will Knox?" Toby spat in the water. He looked around carefully before answering. So if he's looking around carefully, what do you think? Why did he do that? It's because he doesn't want to get hurt. At least not by the wrong ears. Then he grinned. He said he and the colonel have took themselves off to Fort Ticonderoga. They're aiming to collect the cannons up there and bring them back to headquarters. Paul was surprised. The Ticonderoga cannons? So that was the colonel's secret plan, and a mighty clever one. Those big guns, he said, will be useful when they get here. Toby shot him a grim look. If they get here, lad, if. Paul bridled. I'm not worried. The colonel will have many a good hand with him. The boatman nodded. Aye, but the one he needs is the hand of Providence. Now, what are you like? Well, what's the hand of Providence mean? Well, hand of Providence can mean a couple of things. It can mean like the hand or blessing of God or a lot of good luck. And they do, because we talked about how far they have to travel. Later, walking home through the dreary streets, Paul heard the church bells again. The mournful ringing troubled him. Old Toby wasn't very hopeful about Colonel Knox's journey. It did seem a bit daft, Paul admitted. Well, nigh unworkable. He turned and looked toward Charleston and the Mystic River. Somewhere, miles beyond Boston, his friend Will was helping to haul cannons over the mountains to save the rebel cause. It was a dangerous mission, and a daring one. But would it succeed, or would it end in failure? None can say. Chimed the bells. None can say. None can say. All right, so chapter 10, heading overland. Back to who? Back to William now. The first run from Fort George to Glen Falls was only 10 miles. But to Will Knox, it seemed like 10 times 10, which is 100, right? So he felt like it was really more 100 miles instead of 10 miles. This was rough terrain. The foothills of the Adirondack Mountains, far from civilization, there were no highways here, no paved roads, no bridges or underpasses, no route signs or sheltered rest areas to lighting to chase the gloom. What passed for a road was only a dirt trail, used now and then by farmers, trappers, and migrating Indians. In summer, the trail was often a sea of mud. Now in the icy cold, it was a frozen crisscross of ruts and ridges as hard as granite rocks of the mountains. So, do they have a proper road to take these cannons over? They do not. Now, it's really important that you understand why this dirt trail is so hard right now. So, in the summer, it is covered in mud because everyone's walking, it rains and all that. So, what do you think happens in the winter if all that mud gets cold? It freezes, right? Now, is it going to freeze into a beautiful, smooth road for them to drag these heavy munitions over? No, they're not. All those little divots and cracks and lines are frozen in like rock. And that's why it's not as easy to travel, because the road is not even a smooth surface, what they're working on. Have you ever had to try to push something over something that wasn't smooth and it was heavy? It's not easy. All right. With so many vehicles plus the animals needed to pull and drag them, the colonists' noble train of artillery was spread out for almost a mile. William was in charge of a heavy gun, bringing up the rear of the convoy. His brother, riding a sorrel mare, trotted up and down the line, watching for trouble spots and helping strugglers. So William is near the rear, pushing a really heavy gun, not pushing, but with help. He's in charge of one of the artilleries at the end. Now his brother is riding a mare. Do you know what a mare is? Yeah, he's riding a female horse. So, think of it this way. There are all these cannons a mile long apart. Is it possible that there would be problems along that mile? Yeah. So he's hanging out back here, while his brother is on his horse, and do not judge my horse drawing. He's riding his horse. Yeah. Up and down, going back and forth, checking on everyone to make sure that they're doing okay. And helping them if they need help. Okay. The guns crawled slowly along the bumpy route, and every yard was hard work. Wagon wheels creaked, drivers cracked their whips, oxen strained, horses whinnied. Men swore and shouted, sweating under their wool shirts while their breath came out in icy clouds. The Becker's wagon, with its brass cannon, was near the middle of the convoy. Sitting beside his father, J.P. watched the careful way the old veteran handled the team. Controlling 4 horses on this kind of rough trail took nerve and skill. Half rising from his seat, reins threaded in his strong fingers, Becker guided the animals, calming and coaxing them. Suddenly, as they topped the hill, their lead horse stumbled on a sharp rock. "Look out!" Becker shouted. The heavy wagon lurched to one side. J.P. slid from his perch and landed hard on the ground. He got up dizzily, rubbing his sore hip. but his pride was wounded more than his body. Colonel Knox rode up and was relieved to see that JP wasn't seriously hurt, but the wagon had skidded off into a ditch. Half a dozen troopers were needed, with Becker handling the horses to get the heavy cart back on the trail. By the time the cart was righted and ready to move, the front half of the convoy had lumbered ahead, leaving a wide gap in the line. So, remember, if there's trouble, the ones in front are going to keep going while the ones in the back have to wait. So now, this 1 mile, there's a big gap now. And now it's probably way more, greater than 1 mile. This is why it was hard work. The accident led to a change in the rules. From now on, Henry announced at the next rest stop, when the unit gets in trouble, the whole caravan will halt. That way we will keep everyone close together, and we'll have enough manpower in case there's serious trouble. Day faded into dark, and as the convoy struggled on, and by the time they reached Glens Falls, men and animals were bone weary. The strange parade received a wonderful welcome from the villagers. Certainly the artillery train was the most exciting thing that had ever happened to this tiny, out-of-the-way place. The animals were quickly unhitched, fed, watered, and given shelter. The men were treated with great platters of hot food, and warm, dry beds were found for them in barns and farmhouses. So the villagers are helping them get well rested, and I think they appreciate it. At least I hope so. The town had a small inn and a coach stop for travelers, and the innkeeper bustled about tidying a room for Colonel Knox. After a good meal washed down with hot cider, Henry met with Will and the other convoy leaders. Their next goal was to cross the upper Hudson and turn south to Saratoga. The river's frozen solid, so we won't have any trouble crossing, the colonel said. So they're going to cross the Hudson River going over the ice. Will chimed in. The locals say snow's on the way. I expect a good fall of wet snow would make it easier for the sleds. His brother nodded. You're right. We can move twice as fast over snow, if it's not too heavy. So let's gamble. We'll wait here a bit and pray for a white Christmas. So that was chapter 10. Now we're on to chapter 11. Into the storm. So the snowstorm, I think it's about to hit. On Christmas Eve, Henry Knox got his wish. It finally began to snow. Fat white flakes fell steadily, blanketing the trails and adorned the branches and pines. Early Christmas morning, the men rolled out of their warm beds. Oh, no one likes to do that. Washed up and ate a quick breakfast and harnessed the animals. Eager to begin, Henry gave the signal and the guns crept slowly out of Glens Falls. Just below town, there where the Hudson made a loop, the river was solidly frozen. With relief, Will saw that the ice was very thick enough to carry heavy sleds and carts. The good crust of snow made the traction will give traction for the animals. So can you imagine if the animals had to walk on solid ice? And now we're talking oxes and horses. It'll be slippery for them. But with the snow, they got a little resistance so they don't slip and slide. The drivers all made their crossing safely. Ooh. And then they headed for Saratoga. From there, the colonel hoped to push right on to Albany. The recent snow had been a big help, and the men were in good spirits. At the rear of the column, Henry rode alongside William's sled with its giant 24-pounder. If our luck holds, he said, we'll be right on schedule, little brother. No doubt about it. The general will have his cannons in 2 more weeks. Will watched the colonel trot in the front of the line, shook his head and smiled. That's what he liked about Henry. The man was always so cheerful and optimistic. So sure, everything would work out as far as Colonel Knox was concerned. Bad luck was something that only happened to other folks. Henry passed the Becker's wagon and gave them a friendly wave. Perched high on his seat, J.P. could see the whole column. Craning his neck, he could even spy Will Knox, whom he admired, bringing up the rear. The drivers in their gray scarves and caps, and troopers in their blue tunics, the guns of iron and glowing brass, the sleek muscle of the straining horses with shiny leather harnesses, and the brown oxen bending their wooden yokes. Everything stood out crystal sharp against the dazzling snow. J.P. Becker decided that he'd never seen a grander sight. When they reached Saratoga, the tired men received a welcome, much like the one at Glens Falls. It looked to William as if everyone in town came running to greet them. And in the spirit of Christmas, people brought baskets of food and jugs of ale and cider. The next morning, the men started out again, but as they moved through the Hudson Valley, leaving the Adirondacks behind, their luck changed. Oh, so it was smooth sailing till now. Let's see. Instead of stopping, the snow began to fall more heavily. And slowly, their kind helper became their ugly enemy. So the snow was a blessing at first, and now it's their enemy. Why do you think that is? The temperature dropped, the wind rose, and 8 miles below Saratoga, the convoy found itself smack in the middle of a raging storm. Waves of snow fell and howling wind whipped stinging needles of ice into the face of men and animals. It piled up giant drifts that blocked the trail. Time after time, Will and the others had to climb down and shovel the drifts away before they could push on. Along with this came bitter, bone-chilling cold. Huddled on the seat, leaning against his father, J.P. thought he would never feel warm again. He wrapped pieces of burlap over his shoes, but his feet were blocks of ice. His hands were numb in their wool gloves, even tucked inside his coat pockets, and his wide-brimmed hat was yanked so far down over his frozen ears that he couldn't see anything in front of him. Not that there was anything to see through the fierce driving sleet. Henry and Will did their best to keep their convoy moving. Horses and oxen struggled bravely through the 10 inches of snow, then 12 inches, then 18 inches. Soon the animals were fighting through the snow well over 2 feet deep. Oh my goodness, these poor animals. They have to pull all this weight. Now they got to compete with 2 feet of snow in front of them. That's a lot. Now 2 feet doesn't sound like a lot, but if any of you have ever walked in a deep snow, walking is easy when it's a little bit. But we got to think of it this way. Horses and oxen, they're about, and don't laugh at my drawing, they're about, I'd say 6 feet. 2 feet, that's about maybe up to their knees. Maybe a little less, maybe a little over. I'm estimating here. So if you had to walk through snow like that and you had to carry a heavy cargo behind you, I don't care what kind of animal you are or person, that's hard work for these animals. Let's see. The snow was simply too thick. In the teeth of this blizzard, the convoy came to a dead halt, and Henry called a conference. "We are just north of the town of Stillwater," he said. "Some of us will have to get through to the town on foot and bring help." The animals were unhitched and led into a grove of pine trees where they had a little shelter. Most of the men, with Will in charge, stayed to build fires, guard the wagons, and tend to the weary animals. The rest of the party, led by Henry, started hiking. From the grove, William watched the hikers disappear into the blinding whirl of white. For the first time during this trip, the young soldier felt a pang of doubt, a nagging feeling that they might fail. He fought the unpleasant feeling, but it kept returning to torment him. Standing there with sleet stinging his face, he began to wonder if their noble train of artillery had finally come to the real end of the line. Last chapter for today, guys. Chapter 12, A New Start. Alright. The rescue party trudged blindly through the storm, and even for a husky 6-footer like Henry Knox, it was a grueling march. For several miles they struggled through snow 3 feet deep. Oof, it's growing. There was no path or trail to guide them. Their breaths came in gasps as they floundered in deep drifts, often losing their footing. It was exhausting and numb with cold. They staggered into Stillwater and were taken to a home of Squire Fisher. Bowls of hot broth eaten in front of an open fire helped to revive the frozen hikers. When the squire heard Henry's story, he sent his farmhands with food and supplies to relieve the crew trapped in the pine grove. Then he lent Henry his fastest horse, so the colonel could race ahead to Albany. Meanwhile, in the snowbound grove, Will did his best to keep the animals warm and raise the men's failing spirits. He joked with young J.P., who seemed frightened, but trying hard not to show it. By the evening, the storm had passed, and the wind finally died down. Henry, riding the fast mount, managed to reach Albany at last, and hurried to see General Schuyler. The general, who was one of the doubters, still thought the plan was crazy, but he admired the colonel's stubborn courage. Most of the horses played out and have been replaced, Henry said unhappily. Some of our men are sick too and need medical help. Schuyler nodded thoughtfully. We'll take care of your sick. I'll send a platoon into the countryside to find substitutes. I don't know how much luck we'll have, but we'll try. Henry Knox had been authorized to pay 12 shillings a day for each span of horses he hired. It was a good fee, but he found to his dismay that there were few takers. The locals all supported the rebel cause, but they knew the perils of winter and the dangers of the trail, and they were afraid to risk their animals. While Henry fretted over the delay, Schuyler's men scoured the area, visiting every farm and hamlet, bargaining for teams and drivers. It took 4 full days before enough replacements could be found and sent to Stillwater, where Will and the others were waiting. Here the changes were made, and the new trains were harnessed in place. Finally, on December 31st, the convoy was ready to move ahead. Their next goal was to get across the Mohawk River, which joined the Hudson near a town called Lansing Ferry. The Mohawk was frozen over, and Henry expected this to be a simple operation, like the earlier crossing. When they reached the riverbank, Will and several other men walked out onto the ice. They drilled small holes here and there to test for thickness. Then they came back with long faces. The ice is starting to melt, Will explained to his brother. It's getting thin toward the middle. Henry scratched his chin slowly. You think it could hold the heavy wagons? He asked. Will shook his head unhappily. Not a chance, he said. I'm afraid they'll never make it. And that's where we're going to stop for today. So go ahead and get onto the Google Doc. I sent you 4 questions. Go ahead and work on answering them, and I wait for your responses. All right? See you later, Room 219, and have a good day. Bye.